And we're live. Welcome back to the LOOPcast. It's Tom, Erica, and Josh, and we're gearing up for Nashville. So we will be live at Courage Under Fire on Friday. Make sure you guys tune in, follow along on socials. It's the first time LOOPcast gets out of the studio and into the wild. I'm very excited for that.
LOOPcast in the wild.
Josh, you ready?
Let's do it.
Well, I'm excited. We have some serious Shark Tank pitches for the guys.
Yes.
I mean, we're going to have Michael Knowles on. We have Matt Walsh,
Yep.
Harrison Butker, and of course, the inimitable Father Mike Schmitz. And
Can't wait.
we have ideas. We have ideas to pitch to them.
I'm getting his workout routine out of him. I'll tell you that much.
I know,
That's my whole
seriously.
goal. But for today's show, and I want to make sure we have enough time as possible for this. So Ross Douthart, Catholic conservative columnist at the New York Times, he got to sit down with J.D. Vance. And I will say, so it was at the American Embassy in Rome. Hopefully Brian's new digs pretty soon, very possible. But it was a day after the papal inauguration. It was right after he met with the Pope. So everything was kind of fresh and raw. And I specifically appreciated this interview because I felt like it was tough. And it was tough in a way that was different than, say, the Maggie Brennans of the CBSs, because honestly, those people really have nothing but contempt and bad faith for people like J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance actually kind of shines in those moments because he really exposes that. But I think what was different about this one was Ross, according to me, and Erica, you know him personally, holds the same things that J.D. Vance does with reverence, specifically Catholic faith. It's not like this is someone who's not Catholic or outside the circle. He's even pretty conservative too. So he'd probably fall along the same lines politically. And so in some ways that made it tougher and more interesting because he spoke the language and he reveres the same things. And so I picked out 4 clips from this interview that I thought were most illustrative of that tension and brought out the most interesting findings. I think great for Catholic Americans, but just Americans in general for insight into the Trump administration, what it's like to be Catholic and the vice president. So really excited to get to all those things. But before we do, the only way we do the show is people like Charity Mobile. So thank you, Charity Mobile, for sponsoring the show. Now more than ever, it's important to buy the way you believe and do business with companies who support what you stand for. That's why you should switch your cell phone service to Charity Mobile, the pro-life phone company. They send 5% of your monthly plan price to pro-life, pro-family charity of your choice at no extra cost to you. Charity Mobile has never raised their mobile plan prices in their 30-year history, and all plans start under $50 before taxes and surcharges. You can even save more on every line you add, making them a perfect choice for families also. New customers can use promo code LOOPcast to get a free phone with every new line, plus free activation and free shipping, or you can bring your own compatible devices. You'll enjoy the same nationwide coverage as the big guys, and their live customer service is based right here in the United States. So to get started, visit CharityMobile.com and use promo code LOOPcast. That's CharityMobile.com, promo code LOOPcast. Okay. Thank you, Charity Mobile, for sponsoring the episode. Josh, you ready to get into some of these clips?
Let's do it.
All right, great. So he started out the conversation with talking about the fact that J.D. Vance is Catholic and the vice president, and that there's been some pretty obvious tension between recent Vatican voices and the Trump administration. So here we go on that.
Clearly, when you have, and clearly there is some tension between Trump administration policy and things that the Pope thinks or the Vatican thinks, how do you as a Catholic think about that tension?
On the migration question in particular, you have to think about what they've said. And when the church says, yes, we respect the right of a country to enforce its borders, you also have to respect the rights of migrants, the dignity of migrants, when you think about questions like deportation and so forth. And so you have to be able to hold 2 ideas in your head at the same time. And I'm not saying I'm always perfect at it, but I at least try to think about, okay, there are obligations that we have to people who in some ways are fleeing violence or at least fleeing poverty. I also have a very sacred obligation, I think, to enforce the laws and to promote the common good of my own country, defined as the people with the legal right to be here. One issue in particular, I talked to a lot of cardinals this weekend, just because there are a lot of cardinals here in Rome. And one of the arguments that I've made, very very respectfully, I've had a lot of good, respectful conversations, including with cardinals who very strongly disagree with my views on migration, is that it's easy to get locked in sort of a left versus right, the left respects the dignity of migrants. The right is motivated by hatred. I think far too many people, obviously that's not my view, but I think some liberal immigration advocates get locked in that view that the only reason why JD Vance wants to enforce the borders more stridently is because he's motivated by some kind of hatred or some kind of grievance. And the point that I've tried to make is that if you are me, I don't know if this is true of anybody else, but I think a lot about this question of social cohesion in the United States. I think about how do we form the kind of society, again, where people can raise families, where people join in institutions together, where, what I think Burke would have called the mediating layers of society are actually healthy and vibrant. And I do think that those who care about what might be called the common good, they sometimes underweight how destructive to the common good immigration at the levels and at the pace that we've seen over the last few years. I really do think that social solidarity is destroyed when you have too much migration too quickly. And so that's not because I hate the migrants or I'm motivated by grievance. That's because I'm trying to preserve something in my own country where we are a unified nation. And I don't think that can happen if you have too much immigration too quickly.
I will say before I had to cut this up a little bit because so he asked that question. I cut the beginning of the question and I cut right after because he was just talking about the vice president of the United States representing America diplomatically. He even talked about a small thing of the custom. People like, why didn't he kiss the ring? Why didn't he bow? And Josh, do you actually know, trivia question, why he didn't do that?
Yes, of course. I mean, because we're a republic, we don't bow before any monarch, any king like that. So when I met Pope Benedict, I had the chance to kiss his ring. I was not representing the United States as the vice president at the time. This is perfectly fine.
Right.
But JD Vance may have wanted to, but it would not have been appropriate, and it would have caused a lot of issues. There were some lefty Catholics online that gave him some grief over that. And it's like, it's just such a goofy thing for him to attack him over it. So yeah, that's exactly why, like, we are a republic. We don't bow before any monarch, anything like that, even one that we might respect and revere.
Yeah, and that's what he alluded to in his individual capacity. But Erica, what did you think?
Well, I liked how he started off with the question of like, should I have kissed the ring? And he did that in response to Ross's question. How do you see it playing out, this tension that might arise between you being a faithful Catholic and you being the vice president of the United States? And of course, migration is the thing, but JD started with that small example of, look, I had to make a personal choice when I approached Pope Leo XIV on behalf of the United States. I wasn't approaching him as faithful Catholic JD Vance. I was approaching him as the vice president of a sovereign nation, a republic, and we don't kiss the ring. And he used that as a way to go into how he thinks about that line when tensions or apparent tensions arise. I thought you had to clip this part out too, but he started off by offering the two extremes. What would be the two extremes of how a faithful Catholic politician would approach perceived tension? He said, well, the first one is you say there's total separation. And say, I'm a faithful Catholic, but what I believe doesn't affect policy. It doesn't affect me representing my constituents. And we'll call that the Cuomo option, right? Like, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I would never tell anyone else, what to, or I represent my constituents.
Didn't JFK make a speech? JFK kind of started that by making the speech being like, I'm here personally. This is where I'm at as a politician.
Exactly. And JFK made that speech in response to the other extreme, which was the concern of the American public at the time that if we elect a Catholic president, he's just going to do whatever the Pope says. And JD Vance said, well, that's obviously wrong as well. And I appreciate he pointed out the hard work that has to be done by faithful Catholics in public office, that we have to be able to think about applying the precepts of our faith, because what we believe as Catholics in terms of what makes for moral flourishing and the common good in society doesn't always fit neatly into these partisan categories that we get. And he, of course, alludes to that at the end as well when he's talking about that binary that tends to come up the left that, oh, you want immigration regulation, you hate migrants, right? He's saying that, look, you have to be able to hold two things in your head at once. One is that every human person is made in the image and likeness of God and deserves dignity. And you have to also recognize that part of that upholding that dignity begins with having a cohesive society in which that human dignity can be expressed and flourished and pursued. So I really liked how he set it up there as a way to understand the inner workings of his mind. I'm glad he's not a Cuomo or a Kennedy, for heaven's sake. And obviously, we don't just want Catholics who are ultramontanists like National Catholic Reporter for the last 12 years being like, oh, we'll just do whatever the Pope says. So it was a great, thoughtful response.
Well, Erica, that's actually a recent trend. Not to stick a finger in there. They were
recent.
Huge fan.
Well, that's why I said 12 years.
Benedict.
I just, I happened to pick that out of nowhere. But
yeah.
Yeah,
I guess. Go ahead, Josh.
No, I mean, again, I think he's right to say that the faith, his faith would inform him, and that it can continue to inform, as he said. So, for example, George W. Bush should not necessarily take marching orders. He's not even Catholic from Pope John Paul II, but it was a prudential matter,
right?
Whether or not to go to war in Iraq. I was wrong. George W. Bush was wrong. John Paul was right.
That actually comes up in this. That actually comes up in this interview. Yeah. Interesting. And this next one, again, a little bit longer. I think listening to in its entirety. I know that we got to cram this within a 1 hour show, but basically to preface again, what I may have trimmed in the beginning was this gets back to the Abrego Garcia case, El Salvador prisons, and he prefaces this all with the black sites from Afghanistan when we were taking people and putting them in terrorist detention, Guantanamo Bay, things like that, and then torturing them. And then, of course, many of them turned out not to be actual terrorists. And so he started off with, look, me and you on the same page, Afghanistan was a mistake, but I want you to be able to see the temptation. I think he called it zone of temptation for a similar strain of what could come out of what you're setting up or legitimizing through the current administration's approach to immigration. So I'm going to play this. I might speed it up a little bit, but here it is.
Like this system is ripe for war on terror style abuses, where you are going to be sending people to prison in El Salvador that advertises itself as a terrible place. And some of those people are probably going to be innocent. Two, some of them are going to be people who have committed a crime, who have some kind of gang affiliation, but who under normal American law, non-wartime law, would end up going to jail for 6 months or a year or something. And again, they're going to disappear potentially into a system for a decade or more or something like that. And that just seems like you are creating a context where injustice is inevitable, even if your intentions are just to bring peace and order to communities along the border or anything else.
Well, look, first of all, I understand your point, and making these judgments, if you take the teachings of our faith seriously, they are hard. Right? I'm not going to pretend that I haven't struggled with some of this, that I haven't thought about whether we're doing the precisely right thing. So it's a fair point, and I know that you think you've got me trapped here.
I don't think I have.
No,
I'm not. All right, let me be perfectly. I'm not interested in having you trapped. We're having a conversation in Rome as a journalist and a vice president, but also as two Catholics, right?
I'm giving you shit, Ross. Trust me. I think it's a totally fair question.
I'm interested in what politics does to your soul.
Yes,
right?
Of course. So number one, the concern that you raise is fair. Okay, the concern that you raise is fair. There has to be some way in which you're asking yourself as you go about enforcing the law, even to your point against some very dangerous people, that you're enforcing the law consistent with, the Catholic Church's moral dictates and so forth. And also, to be clear, I'm the vice.
And also, I mean, after that pitch to your soul, and American law and basic principles.
Frankly, most importantly, American law. But we're talking about, we're in Rome, and so that's why I brought up the Catholic faith part of it.
Position behind you.
Sure. So here's the thing. So with the caveat that I'm the Vice President of the United States, and I am hardly an expert in every single edge case or every single case that has become a viral sensation or that people have criticized us over. But I am, pretty well read on some of the cases. Typically what I find when I look at the worst cases, I mean, the ones that the media seems so preoccupied with, I would make a couple of observations about it. Number one, it is hard to take seriously. Now, this doesn't absolve me from doing my duty as an American leader and hopefully as a Christian leader too. But it is hard to take seriously the extraordinarily emotive condemnations of people who don't care about the problem that I'm trying to solve and that the president is trying to solve. That's not you. It's why I actually take your concern seriously. I listen to most of your podcasts. I read most of your columns. So when I see
Plug.
people who for legitimately 4 years told me that I was a xenophobe for thinking that what Joe Biden was doing at the border was a serious problem, I am less willing. There's a witness element to this, and I'm less willing to believe the witness of people who are now saying that this MS-13 gang member, and we'll talk about that case in a second, this guy is somehow a very sympathetic person, and you violated his civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, I still have an obligation to think about these cases. And I'll tell you, a lot of times I'll read about these cases and I'll reach out to the people who are enforcing immigration law and I'll try to find out what exactly is going on. I haven't asked every question about every case, but the ones where I have asked questions and I try to get to the bottom of what's going on, I feel quite comfortable with what's happened. And the one that I spent the most time understanding is the one of the Maryland father. And, what I found so bizarre about that case is that the American media took one line, and I forget what line it was, but it acknowledged some error had happened in a Department of Justice filing without actually asking the two most important questions: what is the nature of the error? And much more importantly than that, what is the remedy for an error? Both as a matter of law, most importantly as the vice president, but also again as a matter of Christian principle. I think this guy was not just a gang member, but a reasonably high-level gang member in MS-13. I think he had engaged in some pretty ugly conduct. Legally, he had had multiple hearings before an immigration judge. He had a valid deportation order. What he also had was a sort of exception, what's called a withholding order, that basically said, yes, you can deport this guy. No one doubts that we could have deported this guy, but you can't deport this guy to El Salvador because of particular conditions that obtained in, I believe, 2019 when his case was adjudicated. So you fast forward to 2025, we deport this guy. The courts hold that we've made a mistake, and then it eventually gets to the Supreme Court. And I believe, and we're getting into the weeds a little bit of the legal technicalities, but I believe the court term is you must facilitate his return. And I sat in lunch with Bukele, the leader of El Salvador, with the President of the United States and with others, and talked about this case. And Bukele basically said, I don't want to send this guy back. I think he's a bad guy. I want him he's my citizen. He's in a prison in El Salvador, and I think that's where he belongs. And our attitude was, okay, what are we really going to do? Are we going to exert extraordinary diplomatic pressure to bring a guy back to the United States who's a citizen of a foreign country who we had a valid deportation order with? And again, you may say that the judgments that we made here, I understand there may be disagreements about the judgments that we made here, but there's just something it's hard to take serious when so many of the people who are saying we made a terrible error here are the same people who made no protests about how this guy got into the country in the first place or what Joe Biden did for 4 years to the American southern border.
I think it's a fair point. I mean,
the back and forth and the "I'm concerned for your soul."
That was pretty cool.
Quite a choice of words. I don't think he's lying. I think he probably is. And I've read a lot of what Ross has had to say on this. He has a huge issue with the CCOT prison, with sending El Salvador. He also brought up, and I couldn't get to this too, Trump brought up the potential of sending American citizens to the CCOT prison. He's like, this is a huge problem. I thought JD had a pretty good answer to that, of it was covered improperly. But yeah, it seemed like the difference on this was we don't think, it's not that I think you hate immigrants or whatever. I have legitimate concerns of falling into the temptations that we fell into during 2008 Afghanistan war. And I do think some of that's reasonable. Yeah.
And I think the right before they got into this question, Ross brought up this idea of zones of temptations for Catholic politicians. And I agree. Knowing Ross, knowing his family, he genuinely is interested in or genuinely concerned for the soul of those who live in these zones of temptation, which is what he's calling these different issues that politicians can fall into. And really interesting, JD Vance actually brought up Joe Biden as sort of like a cautionary tale that's in his mind. And he talked about, we had Joe Biden started off as a pro-life Democrat, right? He seemed in line with his church. And then because he was in these zones of temptation in the Democratic Party, slowly over the course of his career, or not even slowly, sometimes there was about face, but he slowly over the course of his career, got to a point of falling into the temptation again and again to a greater and greater extent until he ended up being the most anti-Catholic president in the history of the United States, the most pro-abortion, pro-trans agenda, pro-Marxist president that we've ever seen. And Ross is saying, how do you start to see the warning signs, JD, that you're maybe falling into that the zone of temptation here, you start to justify more and more these personal decisions that are about, policy or your party's or your boss's desires, and it starts to change you. So I think there was a genuine desire there to talk about this in terms of, as Catholics, when we engage in the public and JD Vance on the world stage, how do you resist the temptations while also serving the interests of the American people? So it was that was just the setup too. And Josh, I know you had some thoughts on it.
Well, I just think they both let Biden off the hook a little bit too much at the end, because he was basically a dementia patient for the last few years in office. And it's like, look, he was vice president for 8 years. He had a same-sex marriage that he conducted in the White House. He fully embraced the party's, abortion stance for decades before he had whatever the health conditions, with his cancer and whatever else mental faculty. So I think they both let him off the hook.
Yeah, I agree.
So what if in the last year or two, staffers made all the decisions? That Joe Biden, that in fact is the problem. Like if we would, again, if we could, as Catholic laity, not necessarily relying on the bishops per se, if we as Catholic laity would have held these Catholic politicians to account and booted them out of office decades ago for embracing abortion, if we could have cleaned our own house, then Joe Biden would have had a chance to reconcile and realize this, I really need to be better about this. So, I mean, I admire the fact that JD Vance is publicly trying to wrestle with these questions and take the issue seriously. I might not even agree with him on everything, but I admire the fact that he's at least trying to think this through and take these issues to heart.
Yeah. Just in general on the immigration conversation, I think he's in an interesting spot because he's the vice president. He doesn't dictate policy himself in the same way that a president would, or executive order. So he has to go out basically and thread the needle, even if he personally disagrees with something, of like, I don't know if justifying is the right word, but like kind of, you have to go out and sell the administration.
Making the case for it.
And I think he supports it. I do.
Yeah. And I do. And I think not captured in this, which I think is the toughest moment. And that's why the media has picked up on it, all of that. Their argument about the immigration system and court system in the country is that there's been this gray area in which left-wing NGOs have kind of operated to continue to push the envelope. And because he said when he was at Yale in law school, like immigration law was really hot, like people were able to get into it. And the system right now, and I think the Abrego case brings this up, is you can have 2 separate deportation orders and you still are in the country up until 2025. That's so easy to manipulate from the executive level that, you can just change ICE policy. And now all of a sudden 20 million people can show up and receive benefits and all this. Like clearly there's a problem and there's a lack of justice there. And so they are similarly operating within the gray space to work towards what they believe common good and justice is. And I think in a lot of ways, using things like the Alien Sedition Acts, which he's like, oh, well, these are getting shot down by courts. He's like, I think you're kind of missing the point. Like we have legitimate terrorists in the country that their terror and the way that they terrorize communities aren't showing up in, say, FBI statistics or things that, those are all happening in local communities that have just become accustomed to living a quality of life that you shouldn't be accustomed to, like dealing with a level of violence and chaos that is not good for the common good and isn't good for the American citizen or even people that are here illegally in the country. So I guess what some people interpret as chaos, they are interpreting as we are trying to draw the lines of an effective immigration system. And one thing he did give him credit for, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for it, was completely shutting down the border. No one's getting in our country right now. So now the question is, okay, how do we actively go about solving the unprecedented problem of 20 million people, generous estimate, being in our country that weren't there before? It's a new problem.
And here's another question to ask about. Like, there's that congresswoman from New Jersey who is attacking immigration law enforcement officials who are doing their job. And so the U.S. attorney in New Jersey's like, man, new sheriff's in town, and arrests her. And like, I think that was welcome. I mean, like a congressman that would be attacking law enforcement officials from doing their job, like that, I'm sorry, that is not a legitimate form of protest at all. And just because you're a congressman, the Democrats yelled at us for how many years? No one is above the law. Well, that's true then, girl. Welcome.
No one is above the law.
Jail.
As
We
they,
were-
they drummed
we
up
were-
98 charges on.
Right.
Trump
We were
last
doing
cycle.
some editorial planning yesterday, just some brainstorming about like what to cover in June. And someone asked the question, they're like, well, what was going on a year ago in June? Are there any anniversaries that we could like, point to? So I just was like looking through all my notes from a year ago in June. Oh, what was happening in June? Well, Trump was in court like every other day. What was Joe Biden's like Tuesdays and Thursdays? Ha ha ha. And he was, Joe Biden was challenging him to a debate. And but yeah, the unprecedented lawfare, no one is above the law, was the mantra just a year ago in June. And so, yeah, to hear the Democratic congressperson saying like, "Oh my gosh, they arrested me for protesting," you're like, "No, they arrested you for breaking the law."
Yeah.
That's
In
crazy.
the time, I'm going to skip the clip on AI, although I thought it really was
Oh, all
fascinating.
right then.
So I think final point, because I think that was the most contentious moment. Ross, I think, accurately brought up that there was a new segment of voters that were created in this last election, either that were New York Times type voters that voted for Trump and Vance, or there was people that kind of silently were like, I'm kind of glad they won. And now, let's see how it goes for the next 100 days. So he kind of asked him point blank at the end of this, what is your pitch to those voters? So I'll share that clip now.
The voters by proxy in the midterm.
Sure.
You may face the voters personally in some future, right? But to this constituency that was pro-Trump, again, maybe it's to its own surprise, but has found itself sort of shocked at various points in the first few months. What is your pitch to them right now?
I guess my pitch to them would be we came into the administration with what we believed was a mandate from the American people to make government more responsive to the elected will of the people and less responsive to bureaucratic intransigence. And that changing that is not perfect. And I won't even say that we've gotten every decision right. I think that, sometimes, even Elon has admitted we made a mistake, we corrected the mistake. So the point is not that this is perfect. The point is that it was a necessary part of making the people's government more responsive to the people. And I think that if you look over the next, in 2 years, you look at the past 2 years, or in 4 years, you look at the past 4 years. What I hope to be able to say, and what I think is true today and will still be true then, is that we actually have done, with some bumps, we've done a good job at making the government more responsive, at more efficient to the cabinet secretaries or the deputy secretaries in those departments. And that this sort of feeling of shock, I don't dismiss it or diminish it, but I think that the system actually needed some pretty significant reform. And I'd ask people for patience, because we're on the inside of this. You elected us to do a job, and you get to make the judgment with the benefit of hindsight whether we were just breaking stuff or whether we were actually doing something in the service of fixing things. I promise you that I believe that we're fixing things, but ultimately the American people will be the judge of that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously 98% fewer people coming across our border illegally. Success.
Win number 1. 10,000 fewer bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. on the Hill. Win number 2.
And productivity didn't suffer.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's I guess this kind of speaks to what we're seeing now. Okay, where did it go?
Oh,
Where's Tom?
All right.
Here, you're back.
I think I'm back. Jeez, that happens like
Yeah.
one time an episode now. I got to fix my equipment here. Let me switch.
Ask AI for help.
Yeah, AI will solve it. They actually did have a good conversation on AI. Okay, so that kind of gets into, I think, what we're going to be judged on here going forward. And this big, beautiful budget bill. The name of it always cracks me up. The big, beautiful.
I could say this all day. The big, beautiful bill.
So what was interesting, I was going through the news this morning and I saw that we were only able to, so Trump was only able to pass 5 pieces of legislation. And it's historically, I think since the 50s, a small amount. And I think it speaks to the razor thin margin that they have in terms of members of the House and Senate. And what we will be judged on in the midterms is what's going on now in terms of the presidency and the executive action, but potentially setting up for 4 years from now or that next election, 2028, is how much legislative success we have. Someone did bring up a good point in the chat. Josh,
next election is 2016, the midterms, but
2026
midterms. I meant 2028, the presidential election.
Mm-hmm.
So someone brought this up. We often say that we're opposed to big, huge omnibus bills rammed through. You can't vote on individual things. So I think that's the first thing that sticks out to me is it's hilarious. It's a big, beautiful bill that's often complained about, maybe not by Trump himself, but by us in the program. So is there anything different about this? And then what chances are there of this actually getting through? And I guess what are the good things? And then what are the bad?
Yeah, I mean, ironically enough, I hate to sound morbid, but a Democrat from Northern Virginia, Jerry Connolly, who's pro-abortion Catholic, actually passed away, and so it's like the margin in the House is a little bit more favorable to Republicans. But look, do I think this will get passed? There was overnight deals. They were working through the middle of the night to try to win over some Republicans who are in blue states like California or New York. These are Republicans that we need for the Republican majority. And they asked for a little bit more generous SALT deduction, which is allowing taxpayers in very expensive, Democratic states to deduct their state and local taxes. That's what SALT stands for. So a lot of conservatives groused over this, giving them a little bit more of a SALT exception. But frankly, I think this compromise is probably what we're going to end up having to do in order to get this to get passed. I do think, today's Wednesday, I think they're going to try to push this over the course of the night, even rather than waiting to get to Thursday. So it could be a late night session in the House. I think the numbers are going to be very tight at the end of the day. I mean, there's no way Libertarian Thomas Massie is going to vote for it. You can afford to lose 3 votes, maybe a 4th, depending on how many people are in the House at the time. We are definitely in support of it. I mean, if you ask me, would it be, someone actually asked us, we've been writing about this for the last week or two, and we make note of the fact that it expands the child tax credit from $2,000 to $2,500 per kid. It increases the deductions for, that each of us as individuals can claim off for taxes. So, and it keeps and if we don't pass this, the taxes are going to go up.
Right.
First day of
lose
next
the
year.
tax. Yeah.
So all those Trump taxes from 2017 are, those cuts.
The tax cuts. Yeah.
Yeah. They would all evaporate. And all of a sudden the child tax credit's down to 1,000. And our percentage of taxes we pay is higher. So it would be a disaster if we don't pass this sometime this year. Sooner the better. We also like the fact that there's education choice in this bill. And I applaud Speaker Mike Johnson for adding in the religious liberty language protections into it to make sure that got in the final bill. So that was very good to see. Also, there's a prohibition on federal funding of trans surgeries on minors.
Right.
Again, another good thing. We try to get a ban on such funding for adults, but at least we got it on the kids in there. So again, there's a lot of these provisions in this bill we think are very helpful. And, I applaud the Republicans with this razor thin majority, a lot of Republicans in districts, in very blue states. And I think they've come together. Is it the best plan ever? Could you, of course not. Could you make a better plan? Sure. Maybe if you had 15, 20 seat majority, then you'd be able to get a little bit more in. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of good stuff in this bill, including not all of it, but a major defunding of Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
Item number 1.
And no tax on no tax on tips. No tax
on tips.
Now, some people
Slightly less
complaining
important, but also nice.
Some people are complaining that they didn't have, one of Trump's promises was no tax on Social Security. That is not included in this bill because you cannot make changes on Social Security in a reconciliation bill. So you can't complain at him about it for being in this bill because it would not pass. It legally could not get passed.
Yeah.
You need to get to 60 votes, and all this other good stuff that you're trying to get would never happen. We'd never be able to defund Planned Parenthood. But I had people, email in to us at Catholic Vote and saying, wait a minute now, this isn't the best bill in the whole world. And, I said, well, I just like to share with you the opinions of Ross Vogt. He's the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Obviously, he's in the Trump administration, so you expect him to be in favor of the bill. But he said that, he mentioned that critics are attacking it on fiscal grounds. But he said, as a nation, we have had no spending cut victories of any consequence in nearly 30 years.
Right.
The current House bill includes $1.6 trillion in savings. These are not gimmicks, but real reforms that lower spending and improve the programs. The bill satisfies the very red line that the House fiscal hawks laid out a few weeks ago that stated that the cost of any tax cut could be paid for with $2.5 trillion in assumed economic growth, but the rest had to be covered from savings from reform. This bill exceeded that test by nearly $100 billion.
So Josh, could I just ask a specific question on the omnibus in terms of just like putting it all in one? Is the
This is not an
for-
omnibus. This is the budget blueprint. This is a reconciliation bill.
Okay.
So this is setting the parameters of what each of the different agencies should have for spending. The actual spending bills will come later. So there'll be a defense appropriations bill. There'll be a House and Health and Human Services appropriations bill. But each of those bills are going to have to be in alignment with the parameters that were set up in this budget blueprint. So this is not the massive omnibus bill.
That's really helpful.
And I still want the Congress to go through and do the 13 different appropriations bills rather than cramming it all together at once. But when that budget happens, when it gets passed, whether it's in September or it's in December or whatever that is done, it still has to be, lined up with this budget blueprint, which already gives us the defunding of Planned Parenthood, gives us, the expansion of the child tax credit, lowers taxes, keeps those taxes low for several years, and has the ban on trans surgeries and all that kind of stuff.
Got it. Erica, you were looking into this for a while. Were there any common attack lines or misconceptions that you heard out there that you were satisfied by your research?
Yeah, not really satisfied by them. Obviously, like one of the biggest attack lines coming from the left on this is that they're cutting Medicaid and they're cutting Medicare, which is simply not true. As Josh was talking about, certain reforms that are going into place to help fund the tax cuts, to make up for the tax cuts. Medicaid portions of the bill, so this is from Politico, this is the way they put it. Medicaid portions of the GOP bill would lead to 10.3 million people losing coverage under the health safety net program and 7.6 million people going uninsured, according to estimates from the Congressional Budget Office. The numbers are true. They're from the Trump administration, they're from the CBO, but it's missing.
Well, CBO is Congressional.
Independent.
Yes, it's not Trump.
Sorry, the independent CBO. But what it's missing there is that the reason we have so many people losing coverage is because, one, they're tightening up what it would take to qualify for Medicaid. Right now, there's an allowance for perfectly healthy adults who are able to work can get on Medicaid, and then it's very hard to get them off once they take up work. There's also provisions for people who are here illegally in the country taking advantage of Medicaid, Medicare, and that would end under this bill. So the reason why, instead of just like they're cutting the programs, that's not accurate. They're tightening up who has access to the programs in a way that hopefully is just and prudent and all those good things.
Right.
And I would go with that. Go ahead.
Well, and just another thing, like obviously the core people that would be eligible for Medicaid and Medicare stays the same. So what it's talking about is some people on the edges. Obviously the people that are here illegally shouldn't receive it. But then the others, what they're talking about, how could you leave these people out of the hook? The idea is a lot of these people on the margins that weren't traditionally on it before had recently been assigned to it are able-bodied people who have jobs, and we want to shift them away from Medicaid and shift them to the exchange where they'd still get subsidized health care and they'd still get help, but they'd end up having to pay a little bit more into it because, we cannot be excessive in generosity here. So it's like, if we can find some cost savings, if these people are healthy and they can get jobs, great, and save Medicaid for the true destitute, the people who are really truly poor and have no other alternative. If you're talking about the working poor, hey, you could be on the exchange, you can get some subsidies, we can help you out on that, but we want to try to encourage you to enter the workforce. So that's kind of the difference that we're seeing with this. Again, the Democrats make it seem like they're cutting people on Medicaid as if we're throwing everyone out into the cold with no cold.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way to look at it is like, what else do I expect them to do? Like they got to come up with something.
Yeah.
Or
the reality is the way that we spend on Medicare and Medicaid. This is like not the vast, but the majority of our government spending in terms of social welfare programs are these programs, and then of course Social Security as well. And the way that we have been spending and allocating them is simply not sustainable in the long run. And JD Vance talked about this in his interview with Ross as well, that what the Trump administration is trying to do is preserve an America where we have systems in place that 10, 20 years from now, we can still have a flourishing society. The reality is Medicare and Medicaid, as they are currently, cannot continue that way. Fiscally, we're going to drop off a cliff. And so whenever there's this screaming about, oh my gosh, they're cutting it, always approach that with an air of skepticism and ask, what's the difference between cutting and attempting to reform something that is not sustainable in itself? Like I said, same thing with Social Security. When they go through the Social Security and they find like 396-year-olds who are on the dole for Social Security, maybe it's time to look into where we're sending the money for Social Security. So,
although I have heard
time for reform.
I have heard responses back to that saying like, oh, they just hadn't cleaned out the system. Like they're not actually getting money. They're still on there. So that's why it's almost hard.
See.
Exactly. We'll see.
Find
right.
out.
I mean,
we should find out.
We'll see the results. But like, yeah, that's what kind of is annoying to me around this budget time is this is obviously a huge decision. I saw that Moody downgraded the U.S. credit rating, which is
not great, Bob.
News. Not great news when our credit is less trustworthy. And so I don't know if it's like the lack of transparency or that it all feels rushed and jammed at the end, because what's funny is like, this isn't very like sexy to talk about, but it probably will have the most impact long-term on our country in terms of what gets funded, what our priorities are. And it just, I don't know. I don't know what the current process is exactly to get this done. This doesn't feel great. You know, like it would be nice for.
There's always going to be sausage making, deal making in the days leading up to a final vote. You know, it's like we got to do this now because we got a Memorial Day recess. We don't want to kick this can into June, and then all of a sudden it dominate. Then what would happen is it would dominate all of June and July, and you run up to the August recess, and that would be horrible. So it's like you got to have some sort of deadline, set the blueprint, deadline in place so that you can use the month of June and July to actually begin the appropriations process.
Actually do some work, right? Come on, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, and overall, obviously the number of laws that are passed are going to be lower. Again, the norms have just drastically, changed in many ways. Like everything is a filibuster event. I was actually shocked that the Lake and Riley Act was signed into law, that it would actually get past the Senate, like they would clear 60 votes. I mean, I still can't believe that. So the total number of laws that got passed might be lower, but like an actual substantive one got passed. That was pretty amazing to me.
And the Lake and Riley Act did what exactly again?
Well, again, it was just allowed for the deportation of criminals that were convicted of a capital offense. I think it was the exact, I mean, it was not insignificant.
Shock. Like,
which seems like a no-brainer.
We can agree on anymore, I guess. Jeez, what the heck, man?
Oh my gosh.
Okay, but hey, let's go. Some good news now, Erica. What do you got?
Yeah, this was a great story. So there's a representative up in Maine, and it seems like, okay, well, who cares about Maine? But this was really important. So Laurel Libby, representative in the Maine legislature, she was elected a big part because she campaigned on keeping boys out of girls' sports in the state of Maine. And the people elected her. This is, again, an 80-20 issue, even in really deep blue states like Maine. Deep blue Maine. And so she gets elected and she gets to the legislature. She starts talking about this and pushing for legislation. And the Maine Democrats in their legislature censure her. They're like, you're not allowed to speak on the floor anymore. You're not allowed to vote anymore. We're basically saying, what's that called that they do in the Amish? Shunning. They shunned her. They're like, you're not allowed to exercise the authority given to you by the people.
Shunning is one thing.
Yeah, stripping of voting rights is
this is significantly more,
different.
right?
Yeah.
You don't get to speak on the House floor. You don't get to vote.
Exactly. So this was just, talk about threat to democracy, one of our favorite,
I know.
the worst gaslighting ever. So basically yesterday, the good news is the United States Supreme Court granted Representative Libby's emergency application for relief, clearing the way for her to resume voting on behalf of the people who elected
That
her.
elected her. Okay, can I bring up the bad news?
Why did we need to go to the Supreme Court for this?
Can I bring up
What's
the bad news? There was
please?
2 Supreme Court justices that
Oh, I know.
somehow thought.
I'll give Josh 2 guesses. Who were the Supreme Court justices who thought that an elected representative of the people should not be allowed to vote in her own house?
Could it be the Ketanji Jackson Brown, who speaks the most and says the least, and
There you
also Savage Sotomayor?
Bingo.
That's it. You got it.
Who would
Bingo.
like? What is the?
I mean, honestly, if I were a member of this, if I were a member of the Senate, every year I would just put forward an impeachment proposal for impeaching Ketanji Jackson Brown. Like, if you don't know that you don't even know what a woman is.
Possibly be
you're
the
not qualified.
precedent, because of course, does anyone not think that this could be weaponized against them? Like, if someone were to speak on something that people are not in favor of, okay, great, you can't do the job that you were sent there to do, set up by the Constitution. Aren't these people are supposed to interpret the Constitution? What could possibly be in the Constitution?
The best part about this
says that if you say something we don't like, you can't do your job that we were sent to do.
If you did a bunch of advertisements, let's say on left-wing websites, and told people, "Can you believe that in Idaho, a representative was just kicked out of the legislature because they spoke out, in favor of what?" And people are like, "What?" Liberals like, "I can't believe it. How did it be threat to democracy?" And then you click the link, it's like, rah. Actually, it was a representative from Maine who's defending women in sports. Again, all these accusations, like, I just love how much projection the anti-fascists do when they're the ones that really just totally, absolutely believe in fascism.
Right. Yeah. The court. So those were the official Supreme Court statement was retaliating against a legislator for protected speech violates the First Amendment. The second is that constituents cannot be denied representation based on the political views of their elected official. You're like, isn't that the definition of their political views? And then the third was the legislative immunity is not absolute when constitutional rights are infringed, which is the point of a constitution. Thank you very much. So that was good news coming out of Maine. I mean, I just hope
Supreme Court.
On the Supreme Court. Yeah, not coming out of Maine. Good luck to Laurel Libby. I hope she survives until the next election where she resoundingly trounces all of her opposition.
25% of the people in Maine are Catholic. Guys, we need to do better.
Yeah, come on, Maine.
Well, there's also probably really red spots in Maine too. I'm sure that they probably sent her from there. But
for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, my good news, of course, I'm intensely focused on the Prevost family. The boy Louis made it to the White House.
Look at him.
Him and his wife, Debbie, made it to the White House. This guy is living a mega fever dream.
Yep.
His brother becomes the Pope. He ends up on like Newsmax, like every conservative news site of all time, goes out to Rome, gets to hug his brother, but he's sitting with Vance and Rubio with the American delegation, comes back, hangs on the White House.
Goes to the Oval Office. Yeah.
That's
Although,
great.
hey, come on. I know you're from Florida now, but
yeah, that's
Put
right.
on a suit. Don't pull a Zelensky on us.
Come on.
Put a suit on, guy.
Yeah, he did have a suit on for the Vatican, so you got to give him some credit there. But this is kind of a Florida uniform, though. This is pretty much required dress for Florida.
Well, Trump's Florida man too, and he's wearing the suits.
Yeah, it was an homage. Very nice. Now, Pope Leo was invited to address Congress too, which I think is very cool. I think that could be a great opportunity. Hopefully, he sees that as kind of a no-brainer, slam dunk. Was it Pope Francis was the first one to do it?
He was.
So
he was. We talked about climate change, I believe. So
no, but I mean, it is actually kind of amazing. I mean, like Pope Paul VI was the first to visit the United States, and then John Paul and Benedict both obviously visited as well, and Francis had as well. But then for any Pope to have addressed Congress, I mean, to think of how crazy anti-Catholic bigotry we had in the 19th century, and then to have the Bishop of Rome come to speak in front of Congress. I mean, it still just kind of blows me out of the water.
Well, and I just love the picture of JD Vance and Rubio sitting on one side of the desk and Pope Leo on the other. It's like 3 Americans, like American Catholics at the top of the world game. Thinking
it's
about
just a photo. I wish we would have heard what they said. Okay, no. Pope, endorse me in 20. Actually, you can vote. So you
Which
have
one
your
of us should run for
registration.
president? Who gets VP? Yeah.
True. Don't worry. I'll get to that in my Twilight Zone. Big
Oh,
Marco's
boy.
probably very, very shaping up to be on the ticket. Maybe we get a Vance Rubio ticket. Who knows? Josh, any good news before we get into the Twilight Zone?
I keep forgetting about this good news stuff.
Yeah, it's all good. We come to you for the rants, not the good
Hazards
news.
of the job.
So Twilight Zone now. Josh, what do you got?
Well, we talked a lot about, in JD Vance's interview about crime. And I just wanted to point this out. There's a lot of people. We had a lot of crime in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, and people got elected, from like Rudy Giuliani in New York City and all across the country. Joe Biden was big in 1994, passing the crime bill, which he later apologized for. And California voters enacted the 3 strikes and you're out, and some people say, well, that went too far, because then you could have 2 really violent crimes and something that's kind of petty, but then you're out, you're no life without parole. And so maybe it needed to be amended, I suppose. Maybe 5 strikes. I don't know. It doesn't sound as sexy. Maybe it has to be violent ones, but look at this crime statistic, the sheer amount of crime in this country.
Oh my gosh.
That this guy says you could basically eliminate 80% of crime if you just expelled criminals with 3 or more prior arrests, And so again, we had a situation where, it was only a couple of generations ago, you could leave your doors unlocked, but now things have gotten really, really bad again. And so it seems like we go through this cyclical notion here where we put in tough laws against crime in the 80s and 90s, and then crime, goes away in large part. And so everyone's like, oh, that was good. And then after a while, they feel really guilty about it. Like, maybe we're a little too mean. Maybe we need to be nicer, more mercy. And then we liberalize our laws, and then crime flourishes again. And it's like, wake up, people. Like, what do you
cause and effect?
Yeah,
cause and effect.
It's not super complicated.
There's so many criminals that are engaged in recidivism. They just continue to do more and more crime. And so, again, maybe some sort of petty crime shouldn't be included in the 3 strikes. But, I've said it many times before. Rudy Giuliani did more for blacks in New York City than Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson or any of those race hustlers. Rudy Giuliani is the reason why there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people of all minorities that are alive, because you had less homicide, because you put these SOBs in jail. So again, crime hurts the poor. It hurts the marginalized the most. It's easier for upper middle income people to move to the suburbs.
Yeah.
But those people who don't have as much resources, it's a lot harder to do so. And that's why they need they need law and order.
Yeah. I watched an interesting video about prejudice and actually an argument for prejudice. And I think that we, in a lot of ways, have become accustomed to a standard of living that is unacceptable in many specific cases. I think crime being one of them for sure. And it was a series of choices to get us to where we are now. But whenever you object and say that, I don't want to live this way, shouldn't have to live this way, you have to provide like double-blind studies, and it typically conservatives or whatever, they have to have evidence, they have to have this and that. But we were basically handed the gift of prejudice in many cases by our ancestors in terms of what works and what doesn't, right? Like each generation doesn't have to reinvent fire. That wouldn't be a good thing. You build upon what has worked and gets passed on through your ancestors. And I think one of these that seems very obvious to me is law and order. That like we shouldn't have to live, and you don't need to provide double-blind studies or whatever to know that someone that has violently assaulted someone more than 3 times should be in jail. It doesn't even need to be, you don't need to provide studies, you don't need to whatever. Like the argument is, no, we don't do that here in America. We don't tolerate that. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable way of life.
This is what I'm saying. Like, we need less ideology in our country. Abraham Lincoln said it well in his Cooper Union address in 1860 that he defined conservatism as adherence to the old and tried against the new and untried. So if, when it comes to, I don't know, law and order, peace, people living in harmony and peace, like we can try new things, but you know what? We should try as best as we can and adhere to the old and tried, because you know what usually happens when it comes to the human experience on this planet, we usually get to the right thing after exhausting every other possibility.
And then we usually depart from it really rapidly because we have terrible memory as humans.
Everything's great.
Yeah. I know one of the pushbacks I get from liberal relatives and friends who are, they're worried about, inequity in the system and all of that. It's like, well, there's a statistic they'll cite that's, well, most in terms of raw numbers, most crimes in the United States are committed by white people. And I'm like, that doesn't actually affect my interest in law and order, because if you're just holding everyone accountable to, look, if you commit a violent crime, you're gone. You go away. Maybe you get 3 strikes or whatever, but you're just gone. And it doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter who your dad was. It doesn't matter what
he was white, and I'm gonna sympathize with the guy because he's white. Like, no, bro.
Like that has nothing to do
Jail
with
time.
this. Yeah, and I just wanted to bring that up because I think Pogo using the word prejudice, people often equate that with, oh my gosh, you're saying like racist.
Nope, I think prejudice is fantastic. I think we've had a large scale propaganda campaign to assault legitimate good prejudice in the country.
I'm prejudiced against criminals.
Some of which, exactly right. Some of which good. Like, yes, I'm glad that we don't have slavery anymore. And yes, I'm glad that we have an understanding. But those are it's what they did to Bernie. It's the same exact thing they did to Bernie. Like, Bernie had a huge coalition around him, the Bernie Bros. What'd they do? Yeah. They brought up identity politics. They brought up race stuff that maybe the absolute fringes of his supporters did. But what Bernie was addressing was wealth inequity, healthcare, things that most people actually supported, and they destroyed him for it. And that party destroyed him for it. They removed him from that primary, lost Hillary Clinton, and that's how they destroyed him. And I see a lot of the same things going on right here. It's like lumping people in with the most extremes or whatever. Most prejudices, ironically, are actually very good things. I don't put my hand on a hot stove. I don't need to put my hand on a hot stove to know it's going to burn it. Like, I eat food that's been given to me. I don't go out and eat it from the trash. Like, that's a very healthy, normal prejudice. So prejudice have gotten a bad rap. And of course, now anytime you hear it, it's like, oh, you only think of the negative race stuff. Like, I make prejudicial decisions every second of every day of my life. Many of them.
And everybody does. Right. Yeah. Every single human being.
And I would continue to encourage many of them. Maybe 90% of them, I think, are a great idea. So
I wish my 14-month-old had more prejudices. And in fact, I'm trying to inculcate them into him before he kills himself.
Exactly. Right. It's like, this is just normal parts of the human experience. I think we're being tried to beat over or out of people in order to manipulate or influence. And I think a lot of that happens in politics.
We have way too much ideology in politics.
100%.
Way too much.
Erica,
speaking of ideology and testing the new, we have a sea change at the FDA, and this was talk about a sharp break from previous blanket recommendations. But this week, the Food and Drug Administration announced major policy change to limit the COVID-19 booster shots for healthy people under 65. Thank God. It is about time. We are returning to common sense all over the place. So Dr. Martin Makary and vaccine regulator Vinay Prasad, they argued that now drug makers need to provide, so the people selling us the vax, need to provide clinical trial data. Who would have guessed? We need clinical trial data demonstrating that boosters actually improve overall health for the entire population before the FDA is just going to fund COVID vax for the entire general population and make it mandatory. A quote, I love the quote. For all healthy persons, the FDA anticipates the need for randomized controlled trial data evaluating clinical outcomes before biologics license applications can be granted. We don't want a one-size-fits-all regulatory framework. And I love this too. The U.S. policy up until now with regard to the COVID vaccine has been justified by arguing that the American people are not sophisticated enough to understand age and risk-based recommendations. We reject that view. This is so refreshing This is every scientist, every serious scientist should be 100% behind this change, because it's saying, oh, we should actually test the vaccine before we give blanket recommendations.
Erica, can I give you a virtual high five for proving my point about selective application of prejudice?
Yes. Well,
Because
this
these are
maps
the
on
same
perfectly.
people that would ad nauseum beat you over the head with how racist and sexist and all of your prejudices there. But we're like, hey, we have this completely untested, unprecedented vaccine that we're actually going to require you to get if you want to work or feed your family or worship or anything like that. And we actually know about some of these problems too, but we're not going to tell you because we want you to get it. And that's what's most important to us. And you know what the best thing is? To just trust us. We know what we're doing.
Trust the experts.
So there's a vicious streak of selective prejudicial decision making with the powers that be, and even in regards to the JD Vance. Sorry, I don't want to completely steal, but what I appreciate in his interview with Ross was that he at least presented humility. Like, we're not going to get everything right,
Right.
or what am I going to be judged on? I'm going to be judged by the American people in the voting booth, and that's how it should be.
Based on results.
Based on results. And so
What?
I feel a refreshing...
Not the media judging him every day?
Yeah. There's a refreshing injection of humility and respect, I think, for the average American within the Trump administration that whoever the heck was running the Biden administration clearly did not have for the American people.
Right. Two other pieces to this. So we did get confirmation. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations published an analysis this week that, in fact, the Biden administration was obfuscating, they were obstructing records about the COVID-19 vaccine pandemic and the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, including the myocarditis increased risk for particular populations, that those were deliberately obstructed by the Department of Health and Human Services under Biden. This is infuriating stuff. So not only were they just blanket, okay, Americans are just too dumb to understand, like, if you're 16, you don't need the shot. If you're 66, you do need the shot. We're too dumb to understand that, so we just got to do a blanket. And we know that there are increased risks with the shot for violations. And like you said, there's so much ugliness here around these COVID vaccines that whatever benefit they may have, and if there is a benefit, you would assume that objective trials of the vaccine on general population would show those eventually, and maybe people will accept them on the merits. But the attempt to just ideologically bludgeon us with all of this and the cover up, it's going to do even more to disrupt, to destroy what trust is left in these institutions.
In defense of all this COVID-19 stuff, the Biden administration was, we'd say, well, what are your sources? And they're like, just trust me, bro.
Trust me, bro.
I don't just trust you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
No.
truly maybe the biggest stain on the American government, at least health authorities, ever. And that's saying something because they've lied about quite a few things at this point.
Yeah.
But pair that with
in the top three.
Yeah, compare that with
Jay Bhattacharya, is he the head of the NIH? Yeah, he gave a talk to the assembled heads of NIH departments this week and their, co-researchers. They're all in this huge auditorium, and he stands up and he talks about this issue and he says, we should have the humility, shout out to JD Vance, to be able to go back, look at what we got wrong and move forward with a greater commitment to science and to, serious evidence-based recommendations to the American people. Half of the audience got up and walked out on him. Every one of those people who walked out, they should just be fired. Like,
well, you know what the people who walked out were wearing?
Lab coats?
No, masks. I'm not kidding. That's real.
You're just like,
you can't make it up.
How can you object to, we should go back and see what we might have gotten wrong? How can you object to that? Oh, wait.
What we've gotten wrong, what we literally created and funded and let loose on the world. I could do a whole show about how angry this all makes me. Maybe we will. Okay, I have an update. It's no longer little Marco, it's big Marco now. He was in front of Congress and he got to specifically square off with a few people who are a bit critical of his work as a Secretary of State. And very entertaining. So start with Chris Van Hollen.
And I have to tell you directly and personally that I regret voting for you for Secretary of State. I yield back.
May I respond?
You may sit.
Well, first of all, your regret for voting for me confirms I'm doing a good job, based on what I know.
Well, that's
about
just
your
a
record
flippant
and what you
statement,
stand
Mr.
for.
Secretary.
Can I respond, Mr. Chairman?
You may.
I didn't ask
Senator,
question.
please let the secretary have
I'd be
the floor.
happy to, but then I can respond to his.
Your time's up, Senator, and
Yeah, didn't love that
A
one.
new dawn,
And
it's a
then,
new day.
yeah, new dawn, new day, and then he followed up with this.
Salvador, absolutely. In the case of El Salvador, absolutely. Absolutely. We deported gang members, including the one you had a margarita with. And that guy is a human trafficker, and that guy is a gangbanger, and the evidence is going to be clear. In the days to come,
Mr.
you're
Chairman,
going to see who you went to
look,
Senator,
I'm sorry,
please,
Mr. Chairman.
Secretary
No.
Rubio has the floor.
Mr. Chairman, he can't make unsubstantiated
Senator,
comments like that.
Secretary Rubio has the floor. You had
Secretary
your
Rubio
time.
should take that testimony to the federal court in the
Senator?
United States because
Well,
he hasn't done it under oath.
Here's another point, okay? There is a division in our government between the federal branch and the judicial branch. No judge in the judicial branch cannot tell me or the president how to conduct foreign policy.
Little
He should have said,
Constitution
"Did you or
101.
did you not have margarita with?"
Yeah, yeah, I want you on record. That wasn't the only one though. He also squared off with Tim Kaine, Tim Kaine, Catholic, right?
Supposedly.
Two Catholics squaring off in
Self-described
Congress. This one, another great moment from Marco.
But I'm going to ask you, what?
Yeah.
So a well-justified fear of persecution.
Yeah,
you
they
don't
thought
think
that their
that means-
farms
you
were
don't
being
think
burned
that
down and they
means
would be
anything?
killed. I think that's a pretty good justification for wanting to come. They're
Okay.
afraid for their lives.
And should it be applied in an even-handed way? That's an easy.
No, our foreign policy doesn't require even-handedness. It
Well, wait,
requires
but the
prioritizing the interests of the
statutory
United States.
phrase says you are entitled to entrance as a refugee if you demonstrate a well-justified fear of persecution.
No,
I
you're
mean,
not entitled,
So
you're
can you
allowed.
have a different standard based upon the color of somebody's skin? Would that be acceptable?
Well, I'm not the one arguing that. Apparently you are, because you don't
No,
like the fact that they're
I'm
white,
just
and that's why
asking
they're
you to
coming.
say that that would
Boom.
be
Well,
unacceptable.
no,
Yeah,
I would say that the United
bam.
A
States,
very easy
the
thing
United
to say.
States has a right to pick and choose who they allow into the United
Even
States.
based on the color of somebody's skin.
No
you're
one's.
saying.
You're the one that's talking about the color of their skin, not me. These
You're
are
That's right.
refusing to
farms were being
acknowledge
burned
that
down
it
and they were
should be
killed because of the
even-handed.
color of their skin.
Well,
Because
I'm-
they were-
Kaine
Well, you've
just-
Cut 'em off.
demonstrated enough because you think
You
anyone should
lost
be
it.
allowed into this country for any reason because they met a
Who-
certain
who has
criteria.
said that?
We are going to prioritize people that come into our country on the basis of what's in the interest of this country. That's a small number of people that are coming.
But
in
you
that
said
particular
this
case.
weekend that
But
there
in
would
other
be more.
cases, it's harder to vet. In other cases, it's more difficult. And by the way, the United States admits people every year.
But I'm gonna-
Yeah,
It's Big Marco now.
big Marco. Oh, he's just holding the line. It's great.
He's got 4 jobs.
He's
Maybe
like,
he
don't
has
mess
time
with me.
playing
I
at
got
all."
stuff to do.
Yeah, dude, I got work to do. I got 4 jobs. He put out a cool Vatican video too, but yeah, Vance Rubio 20. It's gonna be,
Hi, I'm here for it.
Well,
Gosh.
Rubio came ready to play.
that's for sure. Has there been a bigger rise in recent memory than Marco Rubio?
I don't know. He leveled up, dude. He
Yeah.
was good.
No
Yeah.
question. No question. Other than JD Vance, it's meteoric, but yeah, love that. It's like people found out that you just don't like them because they're white. Actually, is an effective line of attack. Like because it's true. Just no one had
Marco
the
Rubio
gumption to
being
say it, I
Hispanic
guess.
too. I'm just
That's-
like, he's,
That's obviously the reason why Tim Kaine's upset here and why Democrats are upset. And I guess they're too dumb to see that that's the contradiction, or they just want to get out clips of the constituents. I don't understand it. It's like the most obvious trap laid out for Democrats of all time, and they fall for it every time. I don't get it.
yeah. And I love how the white guy is lecturing the Cubano American on why he likes white people too much. Like, yeah, Tim, classy Tim.
Tim Kaine, man.
Tim Kaine's the guy who has to worry about getting sunburned. I mean, he's so white.
Very true. Did he run with Hillary Clinton?
Oh,
Right?
yes. Oh, yes.
What a ticket.
Oh, man. Okay. He would have been the second. He would have been the second Catholic vice president behind President
Yeah.
Biden. Man,
Yeah.
what a streak that
Thank
would have been.
God. Thank God me and my fellow handmaids of the patriarchy prevented that. from-
Yes. Thank you to the handmaids.
Shout out to
Thank
my
you.
fellow handmaids.
Yes. Okay. Well, hey, guess what? We're gonna be in Nashville. We're heading over there tomorrow. It's gonna be awesome. If you see us, come say hi. I'd love to meet some of you. If you're there in person at the Courage Under Fire event, got a great lineup for you guys. Should be a really fun day. And if you want to tune in for that, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can leave us reviews, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. You can email me, loopcast@catholicbot.org. I'm still working through some emails right now. And pray for us above everything else. St. Thomas More, St. Fidelis, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Pray for us. Great show, guys. We'll see you live in Nashville on Friday. Peace.